Good afternoon now that it is, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We of course welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Asking everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off as we begin, it will be appreciated. And of course, our online viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference as well. Our host today is Cully Stimson, a Heritage colleague since 2007. He is manager of our newly created National Security Law Program and senior legal fellow in our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. He is a widely recognized expert in national security, homeland security, and crime control. A third-generation naval officer, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs from 2006 to 2007, where he advised two Secretaries of Defense on global terrorist detention policies and operations. He helped craft the 2006 Military Commissions Act and attends military commissions hearings now on behalf of the Heritage Foundation. He is a former local, state, federal, and military prosecutor and currently serves as the executive officer of the Naval Reserve Trial Judiciary, where he sits as a military trial judge. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Cully Stimson. Cully?
Thank you very much, John. I'd like to welcome all of you, and especially General Ed Meese, to our kickoff inaugural event here at the Heritage Foundation focused on national security law. And I'm particularly pleased that Ken Weinstein, who served in distinguished capacity in the Bush administration, and a good friend of mine, has agreed to join us again today. Thank you, Ken. As I was finishing up my stint here as Heritage's Chief of Staff earlier this spring, I was asked by Ed Follner, the outgoing president of Heritage, and Senator Jim DeMint, the incoming president of Heritage, what I wanted to do next. And it didn't take me long to figure out what the answer was, and that is to really focus on creating a program dedicated solely to national security law, one that's fully resourced and dedicated to that effort. A program that over time would cover all the tough topics like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the Patriot Act, intelligence law and policy, interrogation law and policy, military commissions and federal trials for alleged terrorists, terrorist detention, War Powers Act, the law of armed conflict, drones, or as they're more accurately described, remotely unmanned aerial vehicles, the proper bounds of self-defense in the law of armed conflict and international and non-international armed conflict, and other tough, pressing topics of the day. That program, this program, the first of its kind for any DC think tank, is the next natural step from the work we've done here since 2007 and before. And working with former Attorney General Ed Meese and others both inside and outside of Heritage, we have written and testified and briefed and participated in that national dialogue. I also need to say that I've been inspired and supported and in fact encouraged by folks from both sides of the aisle to set up this program. And in particular, my good friend Ben Wittes from the Brookings Institution and Bobby Chesney, who's a professor at the University of Texas Law School. Their invaluable website called lawfareblog.com is the go-to website, in my opinion, for an intelligent, wide-ranging discussion on all things national security law. And as an infrequent contributor to the site, but everyday reader, I tip my hat to them and look forward to working with them and others in the future on our program. Our program is not a website. Our program is designed to bring the best and brightest national security law experts here to Heritage to present lectures and debate each other and write papers, sometimes of opposing views on the pressing tough topics of the day in national security law. And we're a nonpartisan think tank. And I intend to bring folks from both sides of the aisle here to beat each other up and hash out these tough issues to better inform our audience, which is the Hill and policymakers, but do so in a respectful, nonpartisan way. That is why, for example, I was pleased to invite my friend Jay Johnson, President Obama's DoD General Counsel in his first term here in September in 2011, to discuss whether at that time more detainee legislation was necessary, and Jay joined us to discuss that. Which brings us to today's keynote speaker, Ken Wainstein. Today, Ken is a partner at Cadwalader, which is a law firm here in town, and co-chair of their firm's business fraud unit. But more importantly, and pertinent to this discussion, is the fact that Ken was President Bush's assistant for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. He stood up the Department of Justice's National Security Division, and he was my boss at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, where he was the United States Attorney. He also worked with the FBI as the General Counsel and the Chief of Staff, and he is a prosecutor's prosecutor because he prosecuted the tough cases when he was a mere AUSA in the U.S. Attorney's Office and in the Southern District of New York in their U.S. Attorney's Office. He carried the water, among other people, for the administration in the Patriot Act reauthorization and then the FISA Amendments Act reauthorization. In his previous visits here to Heritage, he talked about, among other things, the need to institutionalize the tools we need in the war against terrorists. He also was here at a critical point after President Obama was elected, but before he took office, to talk about the need for an orderly and proper transition back in 2008 and 2009. Ken is a trusted, nonpartisan, authoritative speaker. He has, as the Washingtonian said, a squeaky clean image, quote unquote. And so in trying to find some dirt on him, just because he's a friend, I Googled it, and you can find out all sorts of Google. And I did find out the key complaint about Ken is he's known for his, quote, penchant for blue ties, quote unquote. Now, I'm colorblind, but I'm told authoritatively that that's actually purple. So he has broken his long line of blue ties, at least for today's purposes. And so with that, we turn the lectern over to Ken to talk about the changing nature of terror and the laws and policies to protect us. Ken?
Good to see everybody. Thanks to Cully for most of that introduction. Yeah, he just didn't realize I do almost always wear blue ties. My father's in the audience, and I wear blue ties because he and my mother always said I should wear blue ties, and so I do what my parents tell me. But I guess I'm going through a midlife crisis because I went with purple today, and I threw you off, Cully. I'm sorry about that. Let me start, though, by following on with the thank yous here. I want to thank Heritage and Cully for having me here today. He mentioned I'd been here a number of times before, and I was thinking back as I was preparing these remarks, and I counted up that this was the fourth time that I've been here to speak about, or been at a Heritage event to speak about terrorism over the last 5 years. And in case you're wondering, don't worry, they're not the same remarks each time. But it's been a pleasure to speak at Heritage on each of those occasions, but I think it's a particular honor to be here today at the inauguration of Cully's new National Security Law Program. I've been involved, as Cully said, in the national dialogue about counterterrorism ever since the attacks of 9/11. And over that time, I've sort of always had particular admiration for those who approach the controversial counterterrorism issues of the day in a measured and thoughtful way, and with an appreciation that the protection of our country is a shared American value that should largely transcend politics. And in fact, it's one that largely does. In fact, Cully mentioned the transition between the past two administrations. And I think if you look at that transition and the fact that there is a marked continuity in the counterterrorism program of both of the last two administrations, you see how it largely does transcend politics. But in terms of that constructive dialogue, that's just the type of approach that Cully has always followed his time here at Heritage. And under his leadership, I expect this new program will play a significant role in fostering constructive dialogue about these issues for the years to come. So my thanks to Cully and Heritage for the honor of having me speak today, and my congratulations to you and Heritage for what promises to be a truly impactful initiative in the world of national security policy. Now, as a way of sort of setting the table for upcoming policy discussions here at the new program, colleagues asked that I reprise some of the points that I made in recent testimony up in Capitol Hill and provide an overview both of the current terrorism threat picture and primarily the threat picture as it relates to al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as well as the authorities that we need to meet that threat. The title of today's talk is The Changing Nature of Terror, Law, and Policies to Protect America, which is particularly apt given the transition in the terror threat that we're witnessing right now. And it's important that we recognize that transition that it's happening and that we carefully assess whether we have the right counterterrorism strategy, organization, and authorities in place to meet that threat. As a nation, we have to continually gauge our readiness to meet our threats, meet external threats to our national security. If you look back at our recent history, since the outbreak of World War II, you'll see that it illustrates both the importance of that process, but also our mixed record of calibrating our readiness to meet external threats. In 1941, we found ourselves completely unready for the threat that struck us at Pearl Harbor. We proceeded to build the war-making machine that defeated the Axis powers over the next few years. And after the war, we recognized the new danger from the Soviet bloc, and we then designed a governmental infrastructure and a foreign policy that successfully contained the threat of Soviet communism. In the aftermath of the Cold War, however, we let our guard down again. While we were enjoying the peace dividend, international terrorism was going through an evolution from the relatively isolated operations of the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and other violent groups of the 1970s into the more globally integrated organizations of the 1990s, a threat that emerged in its most virulent form in the network of violent extremists operating out of its safe haven under Taliban rule in Afghanistan. We underestimated the potency of that threat, and we continue to operate with a military and intelligence apparatus that was largely designed for the Cold War. As we had in the 1930s when the totalitarian storm was gathering overseas, we failed throughout the 1980s and the 1990s to reorient our defenses against the looming threat of international terrorism. Since the attacks of 9/11, the last two administrations have made strong efforts to bring our counterterrorism readiness more in line with the post-9/11 threat. These efforts have included a fundamental restructuring of our governmental counterterrorism infrastructure, new and expanded investigative authorities for our intelligence and law enforcement personnel, and the reorientation of our military to fight an asymmetric war against a non-traditional adversary. Thanks to the concerted efforts of both administrations, the past 7 Congresses, and countless committed public servants, we as a nation are significantly better prepared to meet the international terrorist threat than we were on the morning of 9/11. And there's no better evidence of that fact than the number of top echelon al-Qaeda leaders who have been removed from the battlefield and the number of foiled plots that we've seen over the past few years. It's recently become clear, however, that the al-Qaeda threat that occupied our attention back on 9/11 is no longer the threat that we'll need to defend against in the years ahead. The threat of 2001 emanated primarily from a centrally coordinated terrorist network operating out of Afghanistan and focusing on large-scale attacks against U.S. interests, such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the New York landmarks threat, the embassy bombings in 1998, and of course the 9/11 attacks. This threat has changed significantly since 9/11 in 2 primary ways. First, we've seen adversaries shift their tactics away from the spectacular attacks carried out by squads of operatives and toward the use of individuals to commit attacks without extended support networks or sophisticated operational plans, the kind of attack planning or pattern of attack that Israel has been dealing with for many years. We've seen that trend here over the past few years. For example, with Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, the foiled underwear bomber of Christmas 2009, with Faisal Shahzad, who attempted the bombing in Times Square in 2010, with Najibullah Zazi, who plotted an attack on the New York subway back in 2009, and potentially with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older of the 2 attackers in the Boston Marathon bombings. There are several reasons why this particular strategy shift makes perfect sense for our terrorist adversaries. First, with our extended or expanded and expanding intelligence network and capacity, a small-scale attack is just a lot easier to pull off without being detected. It is becoming increasingly difficult to coordinate all the logistics and all the operatives required for a large-scale attack without somebody tripping over a tripwire that will expose their activities to U.S. authorities. Second, this shift makes sense as it leverages the seemingly expanding group of Americans who are getting radicalized within our own society. While still a minutely small population, characters like Major Hassan, Shahzad, and the Tsarnaev brothers provide foreign terrorist groups with the perfect operative, an American who can fit in and fly below the radar as he orchestrates his attack plans. Finally, the small-scale approach appeals to terrorist groups because they can, frankly, just get a lot of bang for their buck. You can be sure that it has not escaped their attention that two flunkies with a couple pressure cookers were able to shut down a major American city and monopolize the attention of the American people for the better part of 2 weeks. Now, the executive branch has adapted to focus on this threat in a number of ways. On a macro level, they've built up a counterterrorism apparatus that is much better at connecting the dots and alerting us when such operatives are in our midst. On a micro level, the intelligence community has developed specific initiatives that focus on such individuals. One such initiative, for example, is the pursuit team effort that was implemented by the National Counterterrorism Center in the aftermath of the foiled underwear bombing plot of 2009. These teams of NCTC analysts focus on chasing leads among snippets and fragments of information collected across the intelligence community in an effort to identify and neutralize those terrorist operatives before they strike. Now, that's just one example, and much of the after-the-fact analysis since the Boston Marathon bombings have centered on the effectiveness of these measures, a process which I think is very healthy so long as it is undertaken in a constructive and not a gotcha kind of way. Now, that was the one sort of development in the threat that I wanted to highlight. The other major development in the threat environment has been the diffusion of operational authority and control within the al-Qaeda organization itself. Due largely to our counterterrorism efforts, the centralized leadership that had directed al-Qaeda operations from its sanctuary in Afghanistan and Pakistan, known as al-Qaeda Corps, is now just a shadow of what it once was. While still somewhat relevant as an inspirational force, Zawahiri and his surviving lieutenants are reeling from the aerial strikes and no longer have the operational ability to manage an effective global terrorism campaign. The result of this has been a migration of authority and control away from al-Qaeda Corps and out to the affiliates in other regions of the world, affiliates such as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in Iraq, and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. As Andy Lietman of the RAND Corporation has perceptively explained in a recent article, this development is subject to two different interpretations. While some commentators diagnose al-Qaeda as being in its final death throes, others see this franchising process as evidence that al-Qaeda is, quote, coming back with a vengeance as the new jihadi hydra. As is often the case, the truth likely falls somewhere in between. Al-Qaeda Corps is surely weakened, but its nodes around the world have picked up the terrorist mantle and they continue to pose a threat to America and its allies, as tragically evidenced by the recent violent takeover of the gas facility in Algeria and by the American deaths in the U.S. mission in Benghazi last September. The threat from these affiliates has been compounded, of course, by the terrorist opportunities created by the chaotic events in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. The executive branch is adapting its policies and operations to address this development as well. They're working to develop stronger cooperative relationships with governments in countries like Yemen, where these al-Qaeda franchises are operating. They're coordinating with other foreign partners like the French in Mali and the African Union Mission in Somalia, who are actively working to suppress these new movements. And finally, they're building the infrastructure, like the reported construction of a drone base in Niger, that will facilitate counterterrorism operations in the regions where these franchises operate. So that's what the executive branch is doing to address these two new developments. And while it's important that the administration is undergoing the strategic reorientation, it's also important that Congress participate in this process. Over the past 12 years, Congress has made significant contributions to the post-9/11 reforms of our counterterrorism program. First, it's been instrumental in strengthening our counterterrorism capabilities, from the authorization for the use of military force to the Patriot Act and its reauthorization, and to the critical 2008 amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Congress has repeatedly answered government's call for strong but measured authorities to fight the terrorist adversary. Second, congressional action has gone a long way toward institutionalizing measures that were hastily adopted in the aftermath of 9/11 and creating a lasting framework for what will surely be a long war against international terrorism. Some have argued against such legislative permanence, citing the hope that today's terrorists will go the way of radical terrorists of the 1970s and largely fade from the scene over time. That, I'm afraid, is a pipe dream. The reality is that international terrorism will remain a potent force for years to come and possibly generations to come. In recognizing this reality, both Presidents Bush and Obama have made a concerted effort to look beyond the threats of the day and to focus on regularizing and institutionalizing our counterterrorism measures for the future, as most recently evidenced by the administration's effort to develop lasting procedures and rules of engagement for drone strikes. Finally, congressional action has provided one other very important element to our counterterrorism initiatives, and that is a measure of political legitimacy that could never be achieved through unilateral executive action. At several important junctures since 9/11, Congress has considered and passed legislation in sensitive areas of executive action, such as the authorization of the military commissions and the amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. On each such occasion, Congress's action has had the effect of calming public concerns and providing a level of political legitimacy to the executive branch's counterterrorism efforts. That legitimizing effect and its meaningful continuation through oversight is critical to maintaining the public's confidence in the counterterrorism means and methods that our government uses. It also provides assurance to our foreign partners and thereby encourages them to engage in the operational cooperation that is so critical to our combined success against international terrorism. So these post-9/11 examples speak to the value that congressional involvement can bring to the national dialogue and to the current reassessment of our counterterrorism strategies and policies. And it's been heartening to see members of Congress starting to ratchet up their engagement in this area once again. For example, certain members are expressing views about our existing targeting and detention authorities and whether they should be revised in light of the new threat picture. Some have asked whether Congress should pass legislation governing the executive branch's selection of targets for its drone program, with some suggesting that Congress should establish a judicial process by which a court reviews and approves any plan for a lethal strike against a U.S. citizen. And others have proposed legislation more clearly directing the executive branch to send terrorist suspects to military custody as opposed to the criminal justice system. While these ideas have varying strengths and weaknesses, they are a welcome sign that Congress is poised to get substantially engaged in counterterrorism matters once again. At this point, I would propose that Congress undertake two specific efforts to help in our counterterrorism area. First, I'd like to see them fill a gap in investigative capabilities that has largely developed since Congress filled many of the pre-9/11 gaps with the Patriot Act and the ensuing legislation over the few years after 9/11. For several years now, FBI officials have been sounding the alarm about a problem they call going dark, which refers to their increasing inability to get certain communication providers to conduct judicially approved electronic surveillance on their systems. The problem is a complex one, but in short, it stems from the growth of different social networking and peer-to-peer communication services that either do not or cannot provide the government with the assistance necessary to wiretap the communications running over their services. This situation is handicapping law enforcement and intelligence collection and raises the specter that the FBI will miss those communications that might tip them off to the next terrorist attack. It has been reported in a couple of media outlets, and most recently in a Charlie Savage article in the New York Times this morning, that a government task force is preparing draft legislation to compel communications providers like Facebook and Google to facilitate surveillance when so ordered by a court. I hope that a proposal like that is in fact in the works, and I hope that Congress gives it serious consideration. As the FBI has publicly explained, growing dark is a serious problem, and for them, fixing it is their number one legislative priority. Another area that is ripe for legislative action relates to the authorization for use of military force, the legislation that was passed on September 14, 2001. The AUMF authorized the executive branch to use military force against persons or groups who, quote, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, which courts have now interpreted to include al-Qaeda and Taliban and affiliates thereof. However, with the diffusion of power in the al-Qaeda network, that existing authorization may no longer be able to account for groups like Ansar al-Sharia, Boko Haram, and others that pose a serious danger to the U.S., but have little direct connection to anyone who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the 9/11 attacks. As Cully will soon be explaining in congressional testimony next week, there are a number of proposals out there for amending the AUMF to allow the use of military force against those non-al-Qaeda groups that pose a deadly threat to our country. I hope that Congress will look carefully at these proposals and consider how we should go about identifying those groups that are dangerous enough to warrant our use of military force against them. That's a weighty issue, and it's one that the legislative branch is constitutionally positioned and arguably constitutionally obligated to consider and address. So those are two proposals, the going dark proposal and then the possibility of amending the AUMF. But in terms of those proposals or any legislative proposals, in assessing such proposals, Congress should be guided by a pair of principles that their legislative efforts have largely followed over the past 12 years. First, it is important to remember the practical concern that time is of the essence in counterterrorism operations, and that legal authorities must be crafted in a way that permits operators and decision makers in the executive branch to react to circumstances without undue delay. That concern was not sufficiently appreciated prior to 9/11. And as a result, many of our counterterrorism tools were burdened with unnecessary limitations and a stifling amount of process. In fact, the tools used by our national security investigators before 9/11, those who were trying to prevent terrorist attacks, were much less user-friendly and much more cumbersome than those available to law enforcement agents who were investigating completed criminal acts that had already happened. The result of that was slowed investigations and an inability to develop real-time evidence or real-time intelligence about terrorist threats like the one that hit home on 9/11. The Patriot Act and subsequent national security legislation helped to rectify that imbalance and make our counterterrorism tools and investigations more nimble and effective, while at the same time providing for sufficient safeguards and oversight to ensure that they're used in a responsible way, consistent with our respect for civil liberties and privacy. And any future legislation in the counterterrorism area should follow that model. For instance, any scheme for regulating the use of targeted drones, which may well raise myriad practical and constitutional issues beyond the concern with operational delay, any such scheme should be designed with an appreciation for the need for quick decision-making and action in the context of war and targeting. Second, and more generally, Congress should maintain its record of largely resisting legislation that unduly restricts the government's flexibility in the fight against international terrorism. For example, there have been occasional efforts to categorically limit the executive branch's authority or options in its detention and prosecution of terrorist suspects. While there may well be good principled arguments behind these efforts, pragmatism dictates that we should not start taking options off the table. We should instead maximize the range of options available to our counterterrorism professionals and allow them to select the mode of detention or prosecution that best serves the counterterrorism objectives of our country with each particular suspect. Flexibility should similarly be the watchword when approaching any effort to amend the authorization for use of military force. The diffusion of terrorist threats is bound to continue, and new groups will likely be forming and mounting a threat to the U.S. in years to come. Any amended AUMF must be crafted with language that clearly defines the target of military force, but that also allows the government to use appropriate force against all such groups that pose a serious threat to our national security. So, that is my overview of the al-Qaeda threat and al-Qaeda-related threat of today and my modest wish list of legislative initiatives. I mentioned at the outset of my remarks today that I recently went back and reviewed the previous speeches that I'd given at Heritage, and it was an interesting exercise because the topic of all those speeches was the same, which is the challenge of protecting our country against terrorism. But the policy issues of each period at each time I gave those speeches was different, demonstrating how new issues continually arise from the changing nature of the terrorist threat and our response. Today's speech fits that same pattern, and I submit that that pattern is bound to continue for the foreseeable future as issues constantly arise in what is clearly going to be a long war against the scourge of international terrorism. And it's for that reason that we should all be grateful that Heritage and Cully have set up this new program as a vehicle and as a forum for thoughtful consideration and dialogue about these important issues in the years to come. I want to thank you once again for your attention today, and my thanks to Heritage and Cully for having me and allowing me to play a part in this special occasion. Good to see everybody.
Well, folks, Ken has, I think, delivered a wonderful framework for a question and answer period, and he's, of course, delighted to take your questions. I think I'll tee it up if I could and take the host's prerogative to ask the first question, if I could, and that is, as you and I spoke before this program, we talked about the various proposals out there to look at the current AUMF, which was passed on September 18th, 2001. on the one hand, you have folks who will say, don't touch it. Congress may not deal with it in a way that's constructive. It may actually upset the existing ability or authorities in place. It may put at risk operators, military personnel who are utilizing those authorities, and there's just too much danger that they could do something that wouldn't be wise. On the other hand, you have folks who say, just get rid of it. This constant state of war is unnecessary, we can deal with the terrorist threat using traditional law enforcement, intelligence gathering, and then the criminal justice system. And I know you well enough to know that you think that the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. But if you could address each of those types of concerns at the outset, your perspective on each of those arguments.
Okay, thanks for the question, Cully. That's it's a very timely question because there's a lot of debate going on about the AUMF at this time, and as I mentioned, Cully's actually testifying about this next week. So I expect to see my remarks reflected in your testimony next week and attributed to me. No, but Cully has some very well-formed ideas about this and sees it from all the angles. It's an interesting question because, and I think embedded in your question, Cully, sort of are some of the values, really sort of the fundamental issues that need to be addressed here. At one level, there's the very practical concern that Cully mentioned, which is, all right, we have an AUMF that works and has worked for the last 12 years or so. That's allowed us to go after the primary targets of our counterterrorism efforts. And from what I hear, I only know what I read in the newspaper, that this administration has been able to fit within, maybe shoehorn occasionally, within the AUMF, most of the targets they've wanted to go after with military force. And so it sounds like it hasn't been a huge impediment. But it's clear that it will become more and more of an obstacle as this diffusion of authority that I mentioned continues. There's a more and more attenuated connection between serious terrorist groups around the world and Al-Qaeda and the group that committed the acts of 9/11, that's the common element in the authorization for use of military force, that it be against people who were somehow connected to people who committed 9/11. So over time, you just see that it's going to get more difficult, and there's anecdotal information that maybe that was problematic in terms of dealing with some people who ultimately ended up being involved in the Algerian gas facility attack. So if to the extent it's not a huge problem now, it's going to be a bigger problem. But the practical question, though, is, well, gee, you've got something that largely works. If you send it to Congress and ask Congress, tee it up for Congress to deal with, you never know what's going to come out the other end. You never know whether it's going to be something that's helpful or hurtful. And that's true, though, as I tried to point out in my remarks, Congress has a good record since 9/11 in the national security area. They have given us the authorities that we need, and they have recognized the importance of giving authorities which are balanced, strong, but also have the necessary safeguards. I have no reason to think they wouldn't do that here, and that they'd recognize the importance of not reducing our powers, but enhancing our powers to go after those groups that will pose a greater risk to us over time that might not be connected with Al-Qaeda. But beyond that practical concern is the question of and once again, I think Cully mentioned this, are we, as a legislative matter, ready to recognize that this is almost going to be a perpetual war? Because if you look at the options that have been spun out in the press and in the blogs, some of them have a sort of propose a mechanism whereby it's almost like the Foreign Terrorist Organization list for purposes of material support, where you just have a list of groups that are foreign terrorist organizations, and then that authorizes certain government actions, and people can be prosecuted for supporting those groups. Well, if you had a mechanism like that where the executive branch could just keep putting groups on, and the implications of being on that list, however, are that you are then the target of military force, that implies that we're just going to be in a perpetual state of war against these groups that keep coming up over the horizon. I think that that's an interesting thing to grapple with, but I think that's the reality of what we're in. Now, there are different ways we could do this. Obviously, there's a different amount of say that the executive branch or the legislative branch could have in that process. But I think, unfortunately, we're at a point where international terrorism isn't going to go away. It's just going to get more and more effective over time as communications and improve and they get more global. And I think we need an ability, once we identify a group that's a serious threat, not just a minor threat, but a serious threat against our national security, to be able to use all options against that group, including military force.
And I assume you're saying that. Understanding that we're talking about a country's inherent right of self-defense, not in a perpetual state of offensive action.
Right. This is not a matter of, okay, we see a group that we think might end up being the next, it might end up winning the next elections in a country, and we don't want that group to win, so we'll go ahead and take them out with a military strike. This is a group that, like Al-Qaeda, poses a serious threat to our national security. So it's a matter of defending our country.
But why don't you stand there, Ken, and then we'll invite the audience to participate. So if you have a question, please first state your name and your affiliation, and then ask your question of Ken. If you have a question, just raise your hand. In the back, Steve, and then to the next Steve.
I'm one of the two Steves from the Heritage Foundation. I work in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Ken, thanks for so much for coming out and talking to us today, and it was a great address. A lot of the pressure for the United States to roll back its efforts come from international human rights groups and other international law experts that have a different view of the law of armed conflict as we do. And frankly, they don't care much about what our AUMF says or whether we're going to amend it. My question is there a way to better communicate with them that the United States believes that it's in a state of armed conflict with these terrorist groups and that we need to have our domestic authorities and have the ability to operate against these groups in countries other than where there is a so-called hot battlefield? I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but if you had one, I'd be very interested in it. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. One answer is, I think, as I said in my remarks, the more that Congress legislates in an area, the more credibility is attached to executive action that is done pursuant to that congressional authority, and that, I think, gives some comfort to our foreign allies to see that this isn't just the executive branch operating unilaterally, but it's the executive branch in Congress. That's not going to completely please them, though, especially on this issue, whether the use of military force is justified. I mean, keep in mind that, our foreign partners are across the board on this, obviously. Some are completely in sync with our view of things. Some are more extreme than our view, and some are much more on the direction that you were just describing. But to the extent that they are questioning about our use of military force, it's not different from a lot of the pundits and a lot of the really deep thinkers here in the U.S. And Cully was referring to some of the blogs about this issue and some of the really good thinkers who think, look, we don't need a mechanism like this to put groups on a list by which they can be targeted with military force. We can deal with these groups with law enforcement and more traditional and intelligence tools, more traditional ways. So this isn't a position that's just espoused by foreign governments. One thing I think I found in my time, especially working with the Western European governments, is they had a very sort of visceral reaction to anything that militarized the counterterrorism effort. And I was over there, I remember, at a conference right after the Military Commissions Act was passed, the first one in 2006. And they were seeing red about these, ministers from a number of different Western European countries. They're seeing red about the whole idea of military involvement in the justice system. And, you sort of had the sense that to follow on, they said, they took the position that this was not a war. Yes, the Americans lost 3,000 people, but this is not a war. This is really a law enforcement action, not that qualitatively different from what countries had to wage back in the 1970s against the Red Brigades and the like. And to the extent that we were saying, well, no, it really is a war in our view, I mean, the implicit and sometimes explicit response was, no, you guys don't know war. We saw a war. We know what war is all about. So it's interesting, and it was heartfelt on their part. But that's a part of it, that just when you tag military or war in a sentence that talks about counterterrorism, I think there's a bit of a reaction there. I'm not sure there's much we can do about that, other than I think there's probably a dawning recognition of what I was just talking about in relation to the AUMF, which is that, there really is a new paradigm here. And it's not just law enforcement on one end, all-out war on the other, but this is going to be a sort of a state of perpetual serious danger where groups overseas now have the wherewithal to strike us, and not just in onesies and twosies, but really hurt us like they did on 9/11, or even worse if they get WMD. And that is a state that requires something more than law enforcement. And so I think, in some of my discussions with my friends overseas, I think there might be a dawning recognition of that. Whether they would agree, though, to an AUMF that liberalizes the use of military force, when I say they, I mean the folks who are overseas who are the skeptics of our military operations, doubt it. But I think that's the reality. Is this is the world that we're going to be in for a while, and I think ultimately they'll see that.
Dr. Bucci.
Steve Bucci, also with Heritage. To take the point you're making, you're talking about the physical manifestations of terrorism, bombs and things. Mm-hmm. But let's make it even a little more fuzzy. I do a lot of work in the cyber field, and there is a great disagreement as to whether or not cyber terrorism does exist or even can exist. Can you look at that and see if how that possibility, small non-state actors trying to take action in the cyber realm, and how that fits into the law enforcement versus military versus whatever kind of paradigm?
Yeah, interesting. I have to speak to some people tomorrow about the cyber issue, and you might have noticed there was an article, it was in today's paper, about a new Pentagon study talking about the Chinese and the Chinese role in cyber attacks and the purposes behind those attacks, and the possible military purposes. What we have seen is we've seen state actors like Russia and China using cyber attacks as a means of disrupting operations. I think, before they went into Georgia, Russia, I'm not sure if it was ever nailed down there was the Russians, but it was quite clear it was the Russians launched a cyber attack that had at least the intention, and I think the effect of disrupting the Georgian defenses before the troops moved in. So we've seen it as used as a method of war in the arsenal of war making, and I think that's, we're going to continue to see that. And there's a lot of discussion about how the Chinese are, of course, stealing our trade secrets. There was that report that came out recently about that military group run by the Chinese army that's focused on hoovering up as many trade secrets and as much sensitive technology as they can from our government and our business systems. But that also, there's some speculation that those efforts are also intended to sort of scope out our power grid and other areas of critical infrastructure with the purpose of knowing about those systems if and when there's ever a crisis between us and the Chinese, so that they can take advantage of that information to possibly conduct some sort of cyber warfare or cyber disruption. So we're seeing that at the state level. We haven't really seen it to any great degree from terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda issued something out to I think it might have been Inspire magazine or some kind of public statement encouraging its adherents to launch cyber attacks against the West. But in terms of actually launching effective cyber attacks, we haven't really seen that. We've seen Iran striking the American banks, for instance, and Saudi Aramco and others, and that's sort of a form of terrorism. But in terms of your traditional terrorist groups, we haven't seen so much of that. But maybe that's just a matter of them learning the craft and learning the skills. There's no reason that couldn't come within their ambit to do that, and so it's certainly something we need to keep an eye on. In terms of, I'm not sure that actually changes the equation of whether we deal with terrorists in military fashion or non-military fashion. I just think it's sort of one more tool that they can use that we need to be able to respond to.
Other questions? Sir, in the back.
I am Harry Marshall. I'm part of the adjunct faculty at the University of Virginia Law School and former criminal division attorney. I was wondering if you could comment on some of these proposals that have been made to incorporate more oversight before decisions on drone use are brought about, such as a proposal that would somehow incorporate the federal judiciary in this decision-making.
Thanks, Harry. Where were you in the criminal division? Okay, all right. What years? Okay, all right, good to see you. You look familiar. Okay, well, I think, Yep, I guess that's where we connected. Well, good to see you. Yeah, there have been a number of proposals about congressional involvement or court involvement in the selection of drone targets, congressional in terms of legislating it, the courts in terms of somehow reviewing target lists or reviewing potential targets, and it's been largely focused on the possibility of drone strike against Americans, against U.S. citizens, and this is in the aftermath of the Al-Awlaki strike. And that's one of the points I was trying to make in my remarks, which is, look, when you're dealing with counterterrorism, whether it's you've got somebody in your sights and you want to take a drone strike against them, or you, bless you, or you find out about some terrorist operative who's in the Motel 6 down the way and you want to get the motel records and the phone records. I mean, speed is of the essence. You can't let process slow you down. So while there's a place for oversight, and that was one of the points I was making too, which is we learned since 9/11 that oversight and safeguards are a small price to pay for getting strong tools. I'd rather have strong tools with oversight and safeguards than not have the tools at all. But those safeguards cannot be so cumbersome that they undermine the utility of the tool. So in the drone context, the idea that you would have, you go to the court, that raises the possibility of delay that might, deny you the chance to strike at a person. Now, of course, it might arise in a situation where you have enough time. You want to put Ken Weinstein on the list, and then the court can think about it. And this is well before they've got Ken Weinstein in their sights. So there's, there are scenarios where the delay factor might not be huge. There's also a problem with, how do courts assess whether someone is a legitimate target for military action, lethal action? How do they have the background in terms of the intelligence? Should they be the ones making that assessment? I guess they'd make an assessment whether Ken Weinstein or my group rises to the sufficient level of threat that it justifies military force. But it does seem hard to sort of conceive how it is that a judge or group of judges would make that assessment. Now, there are smart people who've come up with this idea and who are trying to hash out ideas. But I think it's going to be complicated.
Ken, one of the things that the administration, I think, has done rather well is a series of speeches by senior government officials, including Harold Koh, the former State Department legal advisor, the Attorney General Eric Holder, John Brennan, your successor, and who was the other one? Jay Johnson from the Department of Defense, the Deputy General Counsel. Explaining in public venues the administration's legal view on a whole host of topics. Jay Johnson did hit one of those speeches here. They've done them at the American Bar Association and other distinguished venues, including universities. But, for example, one of the topics they didn't get out in front of was unmanned, remotely piloted vehicles. And John Bellinger, who we both know, the State Department legal advisor of the Bush administration, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post several years ago saying, you better get out in front of this drone issue and explain the rationality of the American people or it's going to blow up in your face. And of course, they didn't take his advice, and we saw what had happened. So look forward, if you could. What issues are out there, assuming that they would continue this series? I don't know whether they will or won't. What issue or issues are out there that would benefit not only the public but Congress from speeches by senior government officials going forward?
Well, one of them is the topic I mentioned today, which is going dark. And that's, I mean, you sort of look at it a couple different ways. Just to remind you, that's the proposal that apparently is in the works to be uncorked by the administration, which would propose a statutory mechanism whereby providers of communications services would be compelled apparently through like a fine system, but they'd be compelled to provide assistance to the government when the government gets a court order to conduct electronic surveillance or wiretapping over their system. Because right now there are providers who just say, well, that's a nice court order. I see that the court is telling me I have to do this, but I'm not going to do it, or I can't do it. And this is a way of compelling them to, reportedly a way of compelling them to provide that assistance. So at one level you look at it and think, well, that's no big deal. I mean, that's what phone companies have had to do for, since 1968 when the Wiretap Act was passed, Title III, and then of course FISA the next decade. But so, this is just a logical extension of that to peer-to-peer communications and the like. But the other way of looking at it, and this is what opponents have said, is, boy, here you're regulating the internet. The internet is this great, advance forward. It's amazing. It's allowed for the dissemination of information all around the world, and its privacy and everybody's access to it is so important to its effectiveness as a tool of communication and knowledge. And here you're going to be regulating it. And not only going to be regulating it, but you're going to be regulating it against American companies. So you're going to then have the initiative within the communications industry move out of the U.S., move to other countries that don't have this kind of requirement. And it's going to put a damper on development. So if you look at it from that perspective, you think, boy, that's a big issue. And I bet that it's going to end up being a hot issue. I lived through the FISA amendment debates, which ended up at a very good place. Congress did, I think, a fabulous job of coming up with a really balanced but effective piece of legislation with the FISA Amendments Act in 2008, which gave the government the tools they needed to surveil Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. But I think that Congress is going to have their work cut out for them if they look into this, because there's going to be very strong opposition mounted to it, and it's going to be based on these ideals, which are legitimate concerns of the integrity of communication services and the inviolability of internet freedom and this kind of thing. So I think that's one area where the administration is going to have to come out and speak to it and say, look, this is we're not expanding our authorities. We're not being more intrusive. We're just trying to make sure that we're not dark in an area, because if there's a zone of communications that are that are dark to the government that we can't get access to, you can make darn sure that's where the terrorists and criminals are going to go. So that's one of the areas I'd see. And obviously the AUMF is another. And just look, as these groups expand out from Afghanistan and Pakistan and even into, they're now in Yemen and other countries, and as you know, Al-Qaeda tends to gravitate to those areas that have are less governed, the more loosely governed, Somalia, Yemen, and the like. But they're also finding their way into areas with stronger governmental structures, and dealing with those governments and dealing with the threats that might be fomenting within those governments. That's going to be that's a extension of the issue we're dealing with now with AUMF and the use of military force outside theaters of war.
There's time for a couple more questions. Anyone want to ask him another question? Sir, in the back.
Yes, this has been very interesting. I'm Mike Bowers, Heritage Foundation supporter. As we radicalize much of it is appearing in the U.S. amongst citizens, how do you protect civil liberties as you escalate all the powers, the police or military power, to try to protect the citizens as the citizens become radicalized? Do you have some thoughts about how to do that?
So just so I'm clear, so in other words, how to balance...
How do you balance civil liberties with, like, Patriot Act?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple answers to that. One is legislatively. 9/11 happened. I mean, just like any crisis, whether it's 9/11, Pearl Harbor, what have you, there's a crisis, the government reacts, the people react, and there's a strong reaction, right? And everybody's pushing for a more serious reaction and response. And then over time, people say, well, wait a minute, let's be a little more measured here. The immediate danger's passed. Of course, with 9/11, there's a serious concern about a second wave, and there was good reason for that concern. And so, but over time, that immediate danger passed. We started to get our sea legs in terms of counterterrorism capability, and then people sort of said, okay, let's step back and let's look at, for instance, the Patriot Act those past 6 weeks after 9/11. Did we maybe go too far in certain areas, or did we not put enough safeguards in place? And so you then had 2005, actually into the first part of 2006, you had a really intense process up on the Hill, in fact, in terms of political debate, about each of the provisions of the Patriot Act, whether 22 different provisions of the Patriot Act or 22 different types of tools or something, or 16, but a lot of different tools. And they went through each one of them methodically, and then they did add process and safeguards to a number of them, where it was determined that, maybe there wasn't enough the first go-around, which is what's to be expected when you pass a piece of legislation of that size in 6 weeks. So legislatively, you've seen that process. You saw it with the FISA Amendments Act, and I would submit you probably see that with Going Dark and with the AUMF. So legislatively, that's the way you do it. Also, I think it's healthy. The second way you do that is just that there's public awareness and understanding of what the government's doing, and that the public asks the right questions, and that you have openness and debate in Congress and in these kind of forums as well. That's a good thing, and that's why it's good that the members of the administration are coming out and talking about these issues, and obviously there's a limit to how much they can talk about sensitive issues, but that's good because then people see, oh, okay, there's a reason for what they're doing. Alternatively, if they don't see that reason, they don't see a rationale, or they do see sort of unbounded authority in an area, then that ends up moving Congress to try to cabinet somehow. So I think that natural process works as well. And I guess the third way you sort of balance it is you make sure that the people who are on the ground doing the blocking and tackling of counterterrorism work are fully understand their obligations to abide by the rules and to protect civil liberty and to for instance, not investigate and somebody just because they exercise a First Amendment right. And that's the obligation of the leadership of the Department of Justice and the intelligence agencies. And they've got good people heading up those agencies now, and they did during my time as well. And I think people get it. I think that's actually an outgrowth of the 1970s, where you had the Church Committee and you had the exposés about the intelligence community. One of the things we now have is we have this whole structure, legal structure within the intelligence agencies and the Justice Department that are looking at the soundness of our operations, making sure that they're being carried out consistent with civil liberties. And that's a whole mechanism that wasn't in place before the 70s. And I think people need to recognize that, because that's actually sort of a civil liberties safety net for the government.
We asked the very same question a couple years ago here at Heritage, and the result was a monograph, which is part of our Understanding America series, called How America Balances Liberty and Security. And it was co-authored by two Heritage folks, and I encourage you to download that free from the internet, or you can get a copy here and we'll give it to you in the hallway after the event. And with that, I think we're going to bring the event to a close. Please join me in thanking Ken Weinstein for his remarks today.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it, Tom.